Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabesty here. This is the Mythic Brackenspore raid guide, and this is the boss that we decided to do third in Highmaul. It's tough to say whether this is the third most difficult. I think it's largely dependent on your gear, when you actually try out Mythics and all that stuff. But it is an appropriately difficult fight, and it's quite interesting. Most of it revolves around properly controlling all the mechanics that you're used to from normal and heroic, with the addition of two new mechanics that, in addition to increasing the difficulty, also can factor into the randomness of the encounter, which we'll talk about in a bit. So let's briefly talk about raid composition. I don't always think raid composition is very relevant to all Mythic fights, but in this case it can be. For healing, it's not as important. The reason for this is that there is actually quite a bit of healing to do on this fight. Your tanks in particular will take a lot of damage, but perhaps most importantly is just like on heroic or even normal, you have the living and rejuvenating mushrooms to deal with. The living itself is quite simple to heal, but the rejuvenating in particular, once you heal it to full, can be very difficult to keep up with all the other damage that's going on. So bringing more healing than maybe, quote, required would in exchange allow you to deal with the damage that the mushroom like the Rejuvenating is taking and keep it up a little bit longer, thus counterbalancing your extra healing in the raid. So if you're just learning this fight, I would not be afraid to bring extra healers. In fact, we use 5 healers on this fight, which is far above, I think, the normal. I shouldn't say far above, but I'm pretty sure normal is 4. And we found that 5 was able to work once we perfected the rest of the mechanics. The other important thing is tanks. I hate to say it, but there are some tanks that are just going to be superior at this fight. And the reason is that you're basically only tanking one thing at a time, sometimes 2 in a transition if you're slow, but generally it's just one mob, but they hit hard. In particular, the Flesh Eater hits for an extremely high amount of damage, upwards of 200,000 damage, depending on your DPS when you're trying to kill him, which you'll be trying to do. Because of that, if one of your tanks is unable to mitigate any of that damage for any short burst of time, they can die. What this means is that it's preferable to have a tank that has constant mitigation, such as a monk, or significant self-healing, such as a Death Knight. I can't speak to warriors. I don't know what they're capable of these days in taking. I know that monk and Death Knight will work great, and I know that our paladin had some trouble at times. And it's just based on that ability to either constantly mitigate or constantly provide strong on-demand heals. And if you can't do either of those, it can be problematic, and it will require significant focus from your healers at times when that tank is taking the big spikes. So just keep that in mind. So there are 2 new mechanics or abilities on Mythic, and these can be cast every 20 seconds randomly. So every 20 seconds, one of the 2 abilities will be randomly chosen and used. The first of these is called the Tides, which you're going to see here in a moment, and it will send out waves of water, of course, that are dispersed randomly with small gap sections placed between them in random positions. So you'll sometimes have 2 small gaps or sometimes 1 large gap. But other than that, you just simply dodge it, avoid the damage, and that's that. The other special ability is Exploding Fungus, which you see cast right here. And again, this, or Call of Tides, will happen every 20 seconds. It's random which one it chooses. This will just create a series of mushrooms in random spots around the ground, and after a short period of charging up, they will all explode simultaneously. So when it starts to become cast, you'll notice that we all spread out, essentially. And this is just so you can get a clear view of your feet and watch closely that you're not standing on a mushroom. The explosion radius is very small, but the damage is lethal to most non-tank classes. Some can survive hit, Warlocks in particular, with innate damage reductions, or of course with a cooldown, but you do not want to get hit, of course, if you can avoid it. Now, one tip for the Call of the Tides in particular is to try your best not to hang out near the water throughout the fight. You don't want to be near the back wall either, because you don't want to corner yourselves, particularly based on the spreading creeping moss. But if you get too close to the water, it can have an opposite problem where the waves will come in and be very difficult to dodge in time. So if you hang out in the middle, that's going to be your best bet generally. It's also worth noting that the wave's draw distance tends to be very short. So you will often have waves spawn. You'll see the spawn animation or weak aura. And as normal, the description has links to all the weak auras you'll see, as well as some that you don't see in this video. Anyway, so you'll see these spawn actually occur, but you won't see the waves actually on your screen until they get inland a bit. And I believe this is based on draw distance from your character, but I'm not certain on that. Sometimes if you're closer to the water, though, you'll see them earlier, so that makes sense. Anyway, the best thing you can do is just face your camera toward the water when they spawn and make sure you focus on dodging those first and foremost. And then once you know you're safe, then you can do whatever you were doing. And then as for the exploding fungus, there's no more tricks really than what I just said. Just watch your feet, play it safe, spread out if necessary, even if this means exiting a beneficial mushroom temporarily. This is particularly important if you're melee, because the feet of Brackenspore, the enemies, are very large, and they can actually cover up mushrooms if you're not careful. So just watch for that. Another really critical aspect of this fight, and in fact probably the thing we had to focus on most to actually survive long enough to finish, is handling spore shooters properly. And you kind of may be used to kind of ignoring these in normal and heroic. I shouldn't say ignore. I mean, obviously you kill them, but you're not really going to be managing them very well. Whereas in Mythic, it's very critical that you do so. Primarily because if you ignore them and you have players that are getting hit, particularly players that are stacked up, the bolts from those will kill you with other damage, such as infesting spores. So it is critical that you handle these properly. The best way we found to do it was to actually have ranged and healer players run up to a spore shooter and stand in front of it, placing their body between the spore shooter and the majority of the raid. So here you can see I'm running up to one. What this does is this actually blocks the spore shooter's shot. Their shots obey, quote, line of sight, but relative to the player. So if you happen to be standing in a position that will block that shot to wherever it was targeted, since it targets random people, it will just hit that individual player and not the player it was targeting. And this can save a lot of damage. This is particularly crucial when you have spore shooters later in the fight that will coincide with the stacking requirements for infesting spores. So you're stacking inside a living mushroom and you may have a shooter still active, or even a couple. Having a couple people that can stay out of it and self-cool down or heal themselves and then soak up the damage to block these shots is critical if you are unable to actually kill the spore shooter before you need to stack up. The other critical thing is that they are interruptible. So they have a very short cast time, but if you're quick, you can interrupt their cast, and this will lock them out temporarily and prevent them from casting for a while. If they're being attacked by ranged DPS at this time, you'll probably prevent all of their casts before they're dead, which is extremely helpful. So combining these two capabilities will allow you to mitigate the majority of the damage. So there you can see I even rolled into a bolt, soaking it up essentially before it hit anyone that was in melee. It probably didn't matter in that particular case, but just goes to show that you can do it. And there you'll also notice I did get hit by an exploding mushroom, but with a cooldown I was able to survive it, even though I'm a weak monk. So anyway, spore shooters are critical, and handling these properly, particularly with the overlap timings that will sometimes occur with living mushrooms, is key. So the next critical thing to get down is handling of your mushrooms to properly meet the healing and, more importantly, DPS requirements of this fight. So living mushrooms luckily spawn often enough that you can use one for every infesting spores, just like in normal or heroic. As long as you don't let any of them expire or die, you'll be fine. But rejuvenating is more difficult to handle in particular because of the randomness in not only the spawn timings, but of course the special abilities. And the reason that the spawn timings are randomized is because of those special abilities. When Call of the Tides is cast, it's fine because it's just instantly cast, doesn't require any effort from Brackenspore himself. However, Exploding Mushrooms, on the other hand, is actually an ability cast by Brackenspore, and it has a cast time. So during that casting period, he stops what he's doing and starts casting that. And only when he finishes is he able to resume his natural progression of cooldowns and abilities and whatnot. And this offset can cause delays in some of his abilities that have higher or lower priorities in his cooldown rotations. So what you'll find is that on some attempts, you will have a Living Mushroom, say Living Mushroom number 2 and Rejuvenating Mushroom number 2 spawn simultaneously, like almost the same time. In other attempts, they can be separated by as much as 15 or more seconds. This is due to that randomness in those special abilities. Sometimes it will offset them, sometimes it won't. Because of this, it's an unknown factor. You have to plan for the worst case scenario, and this means handling your mushrooms appropriately. Now, there are two different states that both the helpful mushrooms will enter throughout their lifespan. The first is the pre-revival state, as I call it. So when they initially spawn, they'll spawn at 50% health, of course, and they will deal constant damage to themselves through a debuff called Withering. You can see the values on the screen there. The Living Mushroom will constantly take almost 19,000 DPS before it is revived, before it's healed to full health, whereas the Rejuvenating will take 39,000 DPS, so about twice as much, roughly. However, this value is static. It does not increase over time, no matter how long you keep them alive, and this is an important factor to remember. But once you revive them, once you heal them to full health, and they start doing something beneficial for you, then they lose the first Withering debuff and they gain a second one. The second one, unfortunately, does not show up in DPS logs, but through tracking it through healing done, we were roughly able to figure out how much damage that second version does. So here you can see the rough damage per second that the mushroom is taking over its total lifespan based on how long it has been active. And this is just for Rejuvenating mushrooms. I didn't bother getting numbers for living because they're never a problem. It's easy to deal with. So generally speaking, you can roughly assume every 5 seconds that a Rejuvenating mushroom is alive after being revived to full health. It's going to take about 10,000 more DPS to keep it active, keep it healed to full. So you can use this value to roughly estimate how much healing you will need to put on these mushrooms once you heal them up to full. Now, keeping in mind that the mushrooms take static damage over time before you revive them, you can, if you have the healing abilities to do so, save a Rejuvenating mushroom essentially when it spawns until you're ready to use it. We found this to be particularly useful because if you use it right away, depending on the randomness involved when it spawns, as mentioned before, it can give you shorter uptime overall and ability to stack in it based on the other mechanics, namely infesting spores and the spore shooters, because both of those essentially prevent you from stacking outside of some circumstances we'll talk about in a moment. So here you can see an example of this. We have the Rejuvenating in the back, but it wasn't near enough to the Living to make use of them at the same time, so we just maintained the Rejuvenating until we were done with the Living. When that was over, then we were able to heal up the Rejuvenating, and now it's taking its severe damage over time. Unfortunately, this wasn't the greatest use of the buff. We should have moved the mobs closer to it when we were able to, but that sort of shows the idea of the saving mechanic, essentially. So here's a different clip, but the same sort of thing. Here we have a Rejuvenating spawning, but our Living is already up, and they're too far away to get both benefits. So again, we're saving the Rejuve while we deal with the other mechanics, move into the Living, get the heal from that during infesting, and meanwhile we're healing up the Rejuve just to maintain it, but not to revive it to full yet, because we don't want to start that extra damage. Once we're safe to do so, we move over to Rejuvenating, heal it up to full, get the benefit from that going, and now we can maintain this for a much longer period. You'll notice I have a timer that shows how long till investing spores. So if you're able to revive a Rejuvenating to full while you have over 30 seconds left on investing spores, that's generally preferable. You'll get more potential uptime from that Rejuvenating than if you did it when it was under 30 seconds left. So here you can see we have spore shooters, and I think I'm going to die to this set actually, but that's not relevant to the strategy. The point is, if you have the healing to do it, you can save those if necessary to get more benefit from their haste and mana buff later on. Probably a more important technique, if you can master it, is stacking your raid position before Rejuvenating mushrooms spawn. If you aren't aware, Rejuvenating mushrooms will spawn near a player position randomly. So you can use this fact if you know when a Rejuve will spawn next by stacking your raid up pretty much on top of one another and on top of a living mushroom position, forcing it to spawn, forcing the Rejuve to spawn on that position, essentially. So we weren't able to get them quite close enough to stack on top of each other, but we are able to get the benefit of both mushrooms in this position here. There is an overlap area there. It's also worth noting on a side note that the radius of effect that the mushrooms provide is larger than the graphical effect, quite a bit larger, in fact. So it helps to have weak ores or something that'll tell you if you're in it, but just keep that in mind. Anyway, so if you're able to get the mushrooms close enough to one another, you don't have to bother with any of that saving stuff. You just deal with the spore shooters if they're active at the time. Then you're free to heal up the Rejuvenating and the living. And during infesting, while you're all stacked there, getting the heals anyway, you can get all the haste benefit as well. This is a really, really useful technique. If you can master this, this will really help you get the DPS requirement down for this fight. It's just because of the random elements involved that determine when Rejuves spawn in particular, relative to the other mechanics, as mentioned before, sometimes this can be difficult to do. But if you can master it, it will really help you. So practice it at the very least. Another tip that will really help you avoid some unnecessary wipes, which we eventually ended up doing that helped a lot, is to essentially have backup interrupters for all your primary interrupts. So just like in Heroic, you have to interrupt every cast of Decay from the Flesh Eater ad. And because of the cooldown, it requires 2 people with frequent interrupts to rotate back to back. However, particularly if you're using melee, which is going to be common and what we use, to interrupt this, the Call of the Tides will sometimes interfere with the ability to interrupt when the Call of the Tides pushes the player out, or even the tank is pulling the mob away from the wave itself, and it gets out of range just during your interrupt. So, the best thing you can do, we found, is just to have 2 pairs of 2 players each rotating, so that if one of the 2 people in the interrupt rotation misses for some reason, you've got another one that's doing it anyway as backup. So it may feel like overkill, and it could be, arguably, particularly if you have enough ranged interrupts to do so. But it was just a technique that we found that really helped solidify that interrupt rotation and make sure no decays ever got through to screw up our attempt otherwise. Now, the final thing to discuss really is management of flamethrowers. On Mythic, there is 1 extra flamethrower to use, so you'll get 3 in total. However, we found that quite a useful technique, actually, was to essentially have only 2 full-time flamethrower players, with the 3rd person as sort of an emergency substitute. That player mostly spent their time with the raid, but they were able to clear out the patches that were immediately a danger, such as right around the living mushroom where we wanted to move or something like that. The advantage to this is essentially that there aren't quite enough patches, if people are doing it properly, for all 3 people to need to do it full time. And because of that, if all 3 people are doing an even number of them, they're spreading the load equally between them, this actually means that there are fewer patches to burn for each individual player, and then thus those people get lower damage overall, because you still have to account for the movement and all that is necessary. So in reality, we found that 2 people doing the majority, one on one side of the room toward the entrance door and one on the other side toward the opposite corner by the water, was sufficient. The other thing you want to, of course, practice is your technique on actually using the flamethrower. Unfortunately, I don't have any footage of this because I didn't do it in the Mythic. I will have footage in a later video for the achievement, but the basic idea is make sure you have a macro. So you can see it there, /click space extra action button 1, camel case, and that will be able to turn on and turn off your flamethrower. You'll also want to grab probably a weak ore or 2. Again, they're linked in the description to show you when your flamethrower is active, so you can keep track of that along with your stacks of burning infusion. But the image on the screen here shows the basic technique for actually efficiently using the flamethrower. You want to stand in an empty square. If you imagine 3 squares touching of the moss, you want to stand on the empty square that's touching all 3 of those. And then you burn from far left to right or from far right to left. And you do this within the about 1 or 1.5 second deactivation period of the flamethrower. So you turn it on, and then you get a global cooldown, rotation on that button before you can deactivate it. During that period, you spam your button to turn it off immediately. But while you're spamming that, you quickly do your half circle rotation and destroy 3 patches or so. If you do this, and in fact you also move forward slightly as you're turning, you could even get 4 of them in some occasions. But the goal is to try to get 3 and then turn it off every time. If you can do that, you can actually keep your stack going up throughout the fight. One of our flamethrower guys, one of our druids, was able to reach the max of 30 stacks by the end of the fight by doing this technique. So that's the best thing you can do, is focus on using your allotted flame or your energy on the flamethrower effectively, while of course keeping the raid safe. So I believe that covers everything for Mythic Brackenspore. Like I said, it's mostly about getting used to the timings of everything that you're normally used to, along with the extra abilities, figuring out how you can manage healing when appropriate on the helpful mushrooms, along with the extreme tank damage, and then of course managing the flamethrowers and all that good stuff when it's appropriate. So that should do it. Thank you for watching. As always, good luck, and I'll see you next time.